And hello, everybody. Great to have you with us here. Our very first Beyond the Page Book Club broadcast live over Zoom here through WGBH. I'm Brian O'Donovan. I'll be your host for the evening. And as I said, it's the very first for us. So we know there's going to be some glitches, there's going to be some awkwardness as we get used to the technology. But what's most important is that we all relax into this together. It's a great facility to have to be able to broadcast live and talk to each other during this time when we are often so much separated. Today, of course, as you've all anticipated, we are going to be joined by Whitney Scherer, who is the author of this month's book choice, The Age of Light, which I have enjoyed so much. I'd like to give a special shout out at this point to Trident Booksellers and Cafe, who partnered with us on this event to support your local bookstore, support Trident, definitely, because both their bookstore and cafe are still open for delivery business. And we hope that you will continue to show Trident support during these particular times of struggle for small businesses like this, and particularly given the context of our book talk tonight, particularly for bookstores. Before we get started, though, I want to explain how this will work. I know many of you may be new to Zoom or getting used to Zoom, as we better get used to Zoom. In fact, we are still learning things ourselves. So again, let's be patient with each other and forgiving of each other as we get used to this technology. Attendees, that's all of you, will not be on video, so you're quite safe. You can continue to wear those old ragged sweats that you put on this morning, in fact, that you put on last week and haven't changed since. But we will not be able to speak, but we will imagine that you're in all your glory there behind the camera. We do want to hear from you, by the way, and that's what book clubs are all about. So ask questions by opening the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Now it's right down here at the bottom of your screen. It says quite clearly Q&A, and then it'll open something on the right of your screen. It should. And you can type in your question. You can put your questions in at any point in time, and we will begin to reference them after I get a chance to talk to Whitney first, okay? We encourage you to ask anything whatsoever that you're interested in hearing about, whether it be in relation to Whitney's writing style, how she prepared herself to write the novel. You'll hear me talking about that as well, or about the actual novel itself or its central character, of course, who's absolutely fascinating, but more on that in just a little while. You can see a question that you want to hear the answer to, and you can vote for it by clicking the thumbs up, or which will move it up the chain. So when you see it on the right there in that little Q&A box, it'll move it up the chain if you give it the thumbs up. So it might be a question that you would have asked otherwise, but you want to move it up to have it asked on your behalf. So I'd like now to introduce the team behind tonight's event. They will be pulling the strings, connecting with you, but you will not see them. They're the people behind the scenes. Of course, we're used to that here in media, and they say myself as a radio host that I've got a face for radio, so this is blowing my cover a little bit tonight. Jen Gilchrist is our event producer, controlling what it is you are seeing on the back end.
Hi,
Jen,
everybody.
there's
Thank
Jen.
you so much for tuning
hello.
in, joining us. We're so excited about this first iteration of Book Club, and I can't wait to hear the discussion. So thanks so much.
Jen has been a big mover and shaker behind this, as has Bailey Tonini, who will be keeping an eye on our Q&A question box, a very important person behind the scenes as well. We see Bailey. Here is Bailey with the curtains closed behind you there, Bailey, and it's a beautiful evening outside. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're really excited to have you here. I just want to know, when you submit a question, we'd love to hear where you're from. So when you submit your questions, please tell us where you're from. Thank you.
And Abby is with us as well. I don't think she's going to come on screen, but I want to give you a general layout of the event. And as I mentioned before, this is a book club, so we'll be taking your questions on the back half of the event, but feel free to submit them at any point in time. Remember, you can do that at any time. You don't have to wait your turn. Just put it, the question there. And as I said earlier on, if you feel like a question should be voted up, you want it asked next, be sure and give it the thumbs up. And stick around until the end when we will be announcing information for next month's Beyond the Page selection. Absolutely thrilled that WGBH is involved with this type of activity. So without any more to do, it's my distinct pleasure here to introduce Whitney Scherer. And great to have her on screen. You will see her in just a moment. She holds a BA in English Literature from Wesleyan University and an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of Washington. Now, her first novel is, in fact, The Age of Light, and it was published by Little, Brown, and here in the US, Little Brown, the publisher in the US, and then in England on Picador, and that was back in February of 2019. It was a Boston Globe and an Indie Next bestseller and named one of the best books of 2019 by Parade, Glamour Magazine, Real Simple, Refinery 29, Booklist, and Yahoo. She teaches fiction in the Boston area and is a co-founder of the Arlington Author Salon, a quarterly reading series. She lives with her husband and daughter in Arlington, where she is at work on her second novel. And I know that Whitney's daughter takes violin lessons because she poked her head in the door when we were chatting about this book group yesterday. Great to have you with us here, Whitney.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's so great to be here. And thank you to everybody. I can see there's like over 100 participants, and that's so exciting. So thanks to everybody for coming.
It really is a wonderful facility that we have. So we're delighted to have you here, and we're looking forward to a very, very lively discussion on an extraordinary topic. I mean, it could go on for hours and hours, but we don't have that length of time, but we have a fair length of time. So why don't we start, and we'll ask you to read a selection from this book, and you could have chosen so many from my part in this. I could have listened to so many different aspects of it because there are so many different aspects, but I don't even know what you're going to read, so I'm excited to hear what you've chosen for us.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Well, I chose something short because I felt like people don't want to be kept captive here while I'm reading to them for, an hour and a half. But I've chosen something from the beginning of the book, which is actually one of the very short little World War II scenes. And if you've dived into the book yet, you know that there are these little 1 to 2 page scenes that punctuate the rest of the narrative that kind of cover all of Lee Miller's time as a war correspondent during World War II. So I'm going to read the first of those scenes, and it doesn't require any setup beyond that. London, 1940. During the Blitz, bunked down with Roland in Hampstead, Lee wakes more than once to find her bed brown with menstrual blood. Something about the surprise of waking to the scream of the air raid sirens sets her body off, starts her cramping. In the morning, when the blackout lifts, she rinses out the sheets in the sink, but stains remain, light copper blotches. What Lee can never tell anyone is that she feels almost giddy when she hears the whistle of the bombs dropping, when she feels the room shake, when plaster dust coats her face and makes her sneeze. Can never tell them how much she looks forward to the mornings after, picking her way through the city with her camera, the bombed out tableaus arranged before her like the work of some surrealist set designer. A church destroyed, but a typewriter balanced on the rubble before it, perfectly unharmed. A statue completely decimated except for one beseeching arm. The wicked side of her loves the lawless nature of the blasts. One night, she and Roland wake to a different noise, a giant rustling, as if the house is a parcel being papered over. Lee pulls back the curtain, and with a whoosh through the open window comes a ghostly silver fabric, almost consuming her. So much of it that she has to beat it away from her face in order to breathe. A barrage balloon, Roland tells her, laughing, and they go outside and work together to pull all the fabric back out of the house. The next day, she spends hours photographing it, the balloon's carcass draped over trees or twined around her body. None of the shots are right, but then a week later, she is walking through Hampstead Heath and sees another downed balloon, pinned to the ground, but still half filled with air, like a giant egg, 2 geese standing proudly before it. The photo she takes of it is a marvel, the war's first gift to her, and Lee feels buoyed aloft herself, filled with the promise of all that the coming days might offer her. Thank you.
Fascinating. Whitney, that's absolutely beautiful and a way to get us into the whole scenario that you're talking about there. Now, Lee Miller was in London at that time during the Blitz. You're talking about the famous Blitz, and I happened to be in the midst of it. I almost finished with a book called The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson, which describes the Blitz in great detail and Churchill's leadership during the Blitz. But that's a fascinating period of time when there was a randomness to the bombing, and in addition to terror, there was a kind of a thrill to it, particularly for somebody young like Lee Miller, who was an adventurer to begin with. You capture that, you set out to capture that very, very specifically at that time as an introduction, as her introduction to the war. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think it's so interesting because Lee was a person, you know, and we can get into this, you know, as much as we want now or later, but she was a person who experienced a lot of trauma early in her life. And I think because of that, it was one of the reasons that she sought out danger, and she wanted to put herself kind of on the front lines during the war and all of these different things. And so I think for her, there was this energy to these kind of violent, scary situations that she literally kept, you know, choosing to put herself in over the course of World War II. And that began during the Blitz for her.
Really fascinating as well. Of course, the Blitz is often used these days as a corollary to what we're going through here, except there's so much, you know, you could see the danger and sense the danger of bombs dropping. Our enemy, of course, is unseen during this COVID pandemic, but it's not without some legitimacy to have some comparisons made. I'm going to get straight into the character of Lee Miller, though. What a singular person. How did you come across Lee Miller to begin with? I had never heard of her until I started reading your book, quite frankly, and I was just immediately taken with her.
Oh, I know. She's incredible. And in fact, part of the reason that I wrote the book is that when I encountered her, I was so shocked that I hadn't heard about her before. And so what happened was in 2011, the Peabody Essex Museum up in Salem had an exhibit of Man Ray and Lee Miller's work called Partners in Surrealism. And I'm like a pretty big photography buff, and I spent lots of time in dark rooms in high school and college, and I love that space, and I love the kind of hands-on aspect of making photography kind of back in the old days, you know, like we used to do. And so I went to the exhibit because I knew about Man Ray and I knew his work, but I had never heard of Lee Miller before. And I walked in and started looking around, and even just the first room, I was just like mesmerized by the quality, you know, just the like abundance of her talent, and also by just her spirit. She was somebody who reinvented herself again and again and again throughout her life in this way that is so fascinating. She was a model, and then she moved to Paris. She didn't want to be a model, so she gave that up, moved to Paris, met Man Ray, became a surrealist photographer, became a very successful fashion photographer, and then went through this reinvention during World War II and became one of the first female war correspondents. So I found her at this exhibit, and I was like, why have I never heard of this woman? What is wrong with all these art history classes I took? And so the novel began for me there with this sense of like kind of aggravation that I didn't know who she was.
As a woman there in pre-war, you know, male-dominated Paris, obviously, even the art world, even the so-called liberal art world was still very much male-dominated. And this comes out in your book as well, misogynistic as all get out. Now, she was a stunning-looking young woman at that time, and a quick Google search will pop photographs, and you can just really go, oh my God, that's just amazing. But she rejected that. In fact, she kind of eschewed that, because she wanted to be treated like an equal or an artist. And yet, in the novel, she comes to use her looks and her sensuality or sexuality as to get her into these social circles. That must have been a really interesting thing to explore in her life.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was one of the complexities to her life that I found the most interesting, because I felt like her beauty opened all these doors for her, obviously, as it would. If you have beauty like she does, that people are going to notice you. And there are just countless stories in her life of how her beauty enabled her to do things. But at the same time, it was also this giant hindrance and a burden in a way. And I think, you know, if you think about the way that people talk about her now, you cannot talk about Lee Miller without talking about how beautiful she is. And I found that again and again in everything that I read. And then I wrote it too. You know, I mean, her beauty is so wrapped up in her identity. And so I was so interested in exploring how sort of frustrating that would be on the one hand, but then also she was savvy enough to know that she could use it to get ahead, and she did use it to get ahead again and again. And so I loved playing with that tension as I was writing her life.
And you were writing her life, and this book was about to come out at that singular time as well in our history with the Me Too movement, that great time of reckoning. I'm sure that could not have been far from your mind as she was going through her young life story in Paris.
It wasn't, although it's so funny because I thought about her, as I was writing about her, I thought about her as being a feminist before her time. I had that in my mind, and I sort of, she was she's just like a total badass, and she really wanted to be able to do whatever she wanted to do. She wanted to live like a man in a man's world, and she did. But I didn't think to myself like, oh, I'm writing this like feminist novel. But then when I sold the book to my publisher, they of course were like, oh, this is a feminist novel. And I hadn't thought about it that way. I had just thought about it as her story. But if people see it that way, and if people read her story and take it in any way as sort of like a template for how to live your life fully, then I feel like that's really a wonderful thing.
Well, I can see already that we're getting a lot of questions, and we're going to move on to that in just a moment. But one thing that I wanted to ask generally, and this is something that I've always been fascinated with, is writing a book about a person that still has living relatives. She had one son, Anthony Penrose, right? Born in England, I take it, right?
Yep.
And still alive. How do you go about that? Is there a sensitivity to it? Are you worried about it? Because you're writing in a lot of fictionalized or imagined situations that lay bare, her post-traumatic stress syndrome, which we will talk about, her alcoholism, her use of her sexuality to advance or to be involved in situations through the trauma of World War II. Is there a sensitivity in a writer, or do they have to block that out?
Oh, it's such a good question, and it's very. I won't talk about it for the next hour, but I could. Yes. I mean, first off, yeah, you have it in your mind. Maybe not so much the family is just the fact that this is a real person that you're writing about. And so you want to do justice to who they were. You want to represent them in a way that you feel like they would have wanted to be represented. So I think that was the thing that was most in my mind, was that, if Lee Miller were alive today, if she picked up this book, would she feel good about the way that I portrayed her?
And would she?
I hope so. I think she would. Yeah, I really hope so. Because that was like, I just wanted to do justice to her, because I just thought she was so incredible. And I wanted so much to bring her back to, and just sort of make her known to people who hadn't heard of her before, like you, and like so many people who've read the book and have told me like, oh, I didn't know who she was. And I read the book, and then I went down this Google rabbit hole, and I looked at like every photo she took, and I think that's fabulous. But the family, so with Lee Miller, it's very complicated because her son had this really, really fraught relationship with her. She was, she didn't particularly want to be a mother, and he was basically raised by a nanny, and they didn't have a very good relationship for most of his childhood. And he actually did not even know that she had been a photographer until basically on her deathbed. He found out about it because she had taken all of her photographs and put them up in the attic, like she does in the prologue of my book. And she never talked about it to him or to anybody. So he really didn't know this huge piece of who she was. So she was very ill. He found out about it. And then since then, he's devoted his life to managing her archive and working with museums to help bring her memory back to the light, which is fantastic.
And what you've done for this as well, and getting a hold of some of those photographs, is basing scenes that are around, like the one that you talked about in London. That's a real photograph you describe.
Yeah. So a lot of the scenes in the novel are based on real photographs, but the archive is very controlling over her image, and not particularly interested in creative projects that have been done about Lee. They want to have control over the way her image is portrayed. So I've had a very complicated experience working with them.
I can only imagine. As you said, we could go on talking about it. Well, again, we are going to open it up for questions, and there are many out there, as you can imagine. It's just an absolutely fascinating story. and really of a fascinating era, and so many different areas to cover. But just for those of you who may be joining us late, I want to go through the nuts and bolts of how this is done. You can ask anything. Again, make sure there's a Q&A tab, and it's right down about here on your screen, a Q&A tab. Click on that, and you can write in your question at any time. You can vote for the questions that you want to ask of Whitney Scherer here, and we will just open it up in just a moment. Again, thanks to GBH for facilitating this. Thank you, Whitney, for being with us tonight, and I'm going to go straight to a question. Since this is historical fiction, I'm wondering how you decided on your description of the quality of the relationship between Lee and Man. We didn't even get a chance to talk about Man Ray, but I know it's going to come up in these questions. Were there diaries or personal journeys to use as sources? That's from Joe in Winchester.
Oh, hi, Joe. So I worked primarily with biographies, and Man Ray wrote an autobiography, and then there's a number of different biographies that have been written about Lee, and all of those sources go into the quality of their relationship. So I started there, and then I fictionalized and imagined, you know, the sort of the texture of the relationship from what I had read in the biographies.
I gotcha. There are scenes in the book that seem to be based around our photos, like we talked about. That one in the bathtub, is that how you chose the war scenes? The one in the bathtub is of course, probably her most famous, again, because of what it was. Describe what that photograph was and how you based a whole segment around it.
Yeah, so if people are not familiar with Lee Miller and haven't yet seen this photo, it's kind of the sort of the most iconic photo of her and by her. She helped stage it, and it's Lee Miller taking a bath in Hitler's bathtub. And she and her photography partner Dave Sherman, during the war, they got to Munich after Hitler had fled the city, and they got into his apartment before their regiment arrived, and they had hours and hours to rifle through his belongings. And some anecdotes say that they actually took a nap in his bed, which is so weird. But they staged this unbelievable photo of Lee kind of literally washing the dirt of the concentration camps that they had just come from off of her body in Hitler's bathtub. So if you haven't seen that photo, you should look it up. And I did use it. I used the photos from the war as springboards for the scenes, and I would take a photograph and just imagine a scene out from there.
Yeah, how could you not, with the power of those photographs, of course, which she went for. That question is from Anne in Worcester, by the way. And another question from Christine. Kate is going to play Lee Miller in a movie based on Penrose's biography, The Lives of Lee Miller. Were you aware of this when you wrote the book, that this was in the offing?
So yeah, Kate Winslet is slated to play Lee Miller, which is very exciting. Let's see, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that when I started the book. I did learn about it when I contacted the archive, because Anthony Penrose told me that he had signed a film contract. And that was part of the reason that the archive is not currently open to other creative projects, because he's working on a film that's been in the works since about 2015. So, but I think it's very exciting. Kate Winslet's so great, and you know, I think and his book is wonderful. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I was going to actually close on asking this, but since we're on the subject of movies, this feels like a movie to me. Your book, The Age of Light. I mean, there's so many different aspects to it. What it comes to mind now is Babylon Berlin, which is being broadcast currently around about a period in the same time in Berlin. Can you disclose anything, any approaches on movies around this wonderful story you created?
Oh, well, first, that's so nice. Thank you. I have, the book has been optioned actually for a limited series. And I'm really excited about that, because I feel like a limited series kind of gives you the length and breadth to explore the topic in a sort of novelistic fashion. So that is just at the very beginning stages. And, you know, have to have your fingers crossed, because in Hollywood, I feel like everything takes forever and you never know if it's going to turn out, but I'm hoping for the best.
Well, I certainly would be very excited for it. It's just such a fascinating story. Interesting question from Renee. Did you have to learn about complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Of course, she did suffer from PTSD, but did you need to consult with psychiatrists or psychologists or child abuse specialists? And talk about that a little bit for those folks might be tuning in. Not a spoiler alert, but Lee Miller was sexually abused as a child, right?
Yeah, yes. So, yeah, Lee Miller was abused as a child. She actually was, she was raped at the age of 7, and then starting at the age of 8 and going well into her 20s, her father took nude photographs of her. And I would say of all of the aspects of the book that were a challenge, you know, I wanted to make sure that I was honoring that experience that she had that would have shaped everything that she did for the rest of her life. So I really, I did a lot of work around that. And I did talk to, I talked to some specialists and I actually gave pages of the manuscript to people to read to see what they thought about it. And then there was a book that I found really, really helpful actually called The Body Keeps the Score, which is a book about surviving trauma of various kinds. And I can't think of the author right now, but it's beautifully written. And I turned to that again and again when I was writing those scenes.
It's really interesting. I mean, one of the characters that I was particularly fascinated with is the father, because it's the weirdest story. He photographs Lee and her friend that visits her in Paris at one stage together, in actual fact. Now, that's a real character. Did you do research on who that individual was, her father? And what was he like?
Well, I mean, yeah, you know, yes, absolutely. I did research him, and he, Theodore Miller, he was an engineer and he was an amateur photographer. And he, yeah, I mean, I think his relationship with Lee was extremely complicated. You know, I think one thing that was really interesting about trying to write their relationship is that to a modern audience, I think absolutely nothing could be stranger on earth than a father taking these photographs of his daughter. If you think about when they were being taken, it's less strange. I think it happened a little bit more often. I mean, you think about like Alice in Wonderland and Lewis Carroll and things like that, you know. So when I was writing it, I had to be conscious of the fact that a modern audience is going to read those pages and think like, and just be repulsed by the nature of this relationship. But I don't actually think that Lee Miller was repulsed by it. I think that actually for her, I mean, I think it was very damaging for her, but I don't think she thought of it as damaging. I think she felt a lot of love for her father, a lot of, he was really, really supportive of her in a variety of different ways. And so I think when she thought about her father, I don't think she thought like, oh, you know, our relationship is so weird. So it was a little bit of a balancing act to try to put enough of it in to get it across without having it kind of dominate the narrative for modern readers.
Another question coming in from, let me see, will you talk about the structure of the novel and process of getting to that structure? Starting in Sussex, it moves to Paris, the interjections of the flash horrors of the war. This writer, unnamed here, but from Sharon, Vanna would love to hear more about the path you took to get to the narrative arc, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, it took me a long time to write this book. It took me, I spent about 2 years researching it before I started writing. And then I spent about 5 years writing it. So it was a long time. And during that time, a lot of what kept changing was the structure of the book. But I wanted to start it at the end of Lee Miller's artistic life. So it starts in Sussex at this moment where she is grappling with whether or not to be an artist anymore. And I wanted to start it there because I wanted there to be the question in the reader's mind of sort of how could somebody who was as ambitious and talented and amazing as Lee Miller, how could she stop making art? Mm-hmm. Why would she do that? So that's what I hope the prologue does. I hope that kind of puts that in the reader's mind. And then you sort of wind back to Paris and spend the bulk of the novel in the Paris years, which is, to me, kind of the beginning of her artistic journey. But then I wanted to put in the part in World War II, because I think that was the time that Lee Miller was making the art that she was the proudest of. I think she found herself as a photojournalist. I think that was what she was really meant to be. And I frankly didn't know how to write those scenes initially. And so I started writing these these very short little scenes that were based on images from the war. And at one point it occurred to me that the way that they were coming up through the rest of the narrative was almost like traumatic memories resurfacing for someone. Like if you don't want to be thinking about something and you're thinking about something else, that traumatic memory can still come back for you. So in the experience of reading the book, I want for the reader to kind of have the same experience that Lee might have had with those memories, having them sort of resurface and be a little bit jarring in the greater flow of the entire book.
Really interesting. Talk about Lee's relationships with men, how it influenced her art, perhaps the series she did with bell jars, she says here, for example, Lee's relationship with men generally. They were fraught, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were fraught. You know, she's so fascinating to me, which I mean is good, I suppose. But she got along with men better than she got along with women. She didn't have a lot of women friends. But I think a piece of that was that she knew kind of how to use her assets in order to get what she wanted out of men. And so I think that was an element of why she gravitated towards men. She had a lot of sexual partners, a lot of sexual experiences. She had lots of, short relationships. Man Ray, I think, was one of the loves of her life. And then Roland Penrose was as well, although their marriage didn't end up, I think, being happy by the end. They were really happy at the beginning. But she's admirable in many ways, but like all of us, she was really complicated and she was really selfish and I think, kind of egotistical and kind of full of herself in certain ways. And I think that those aspects of her personality were perhaps magnified in some of her relationships with men. One of the war scenes towards the end of the book, remember this gets particularly dark, involves a kitten. It stood out to me, this writer, Suzanne, says, among the other war scenes was that all fiction, or was that a particular encounter that stood out to Lee that came up in your research? So that scene was really hard to write and
hard to read.
Yeah, I hate to say, like, I'm glad you found it hard to read. Mm-hmm. That sounds terrible, but I wanted it to be powerful. It came from an anecdote that I read in a book. She really did what I described with that kitten really happened in the way that I described it, and It's harrowing and really sad.
I think we answered a question of Anne about the structure of the book, moving between the various areas and the various parts of her life. Well, I was fascinated, and this is from Donna, researching Paris, because you went into great detail. Its climate, these are Donna's words, its climate, erotic playgrounds, food and drink, the city streets and neighborhoods, and they all fit like a glove into your book. Donna writes, that's a lot of research. I love the names of the drinks, for example. I went back and looked at some of the drinks that were being ordered, but that level of detail was important to you, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to write about Paris, you have to try to get it right, I think. And it's been written about so much that it's a little bit intimidating, I think, to any author, because it's just sort of like, what can you say about Paris that will be new? But interestingly, actually, I feel like a lot of times when I read books set in Paris, there isn't all that much description of food. And that's like a total blanket statement, so I'm sure it's not completely true, but it's not the thing that I immediately think of about the books that I've loved that are set in Paris. So I felt like that was an opportunity in this book to kind of play and put in a lot of sensory detail, especially because at the end of her life, Lee Miller became a gourmet chef. So I felt like she had to be somebody, she was a person who was hungry in so many ways, hungry for experiences and everything. And so I wanted to portray her as hungry, literally hungry as well, and have her enjoy her meals and be able to describe all those, the smell and the taste of everything, and the drinks too, of course.
The drinks, alcohol, cocktails were certainly a big item back then, and are again. Actually, I was of a generation that went more for beer and wine, but my own kids do these same cocktails and love learning about the ones from the 40s. We talk a lot about Lee, and of course, central character of the book, but there is another looming character in the book, and that's somebody who's better known in popular culture and has been represented in popular culture in a whole variety of ways as Man Ray. Did you explore, Elise writes, in your research, the accusations against Man Ray and the connection with the Black Dahlia murder? What kind of research did you do on your portrayal of that Man Ray character? And this is a question from Elise in upstate New York.
So I am kind of embarrassed to tell you this, but I did not know about Man Ray's connection to the Black Dahlia murders until after I had written the book. And I don't know, I don't know, you know, there was that podcast that came out, oh shoot, I can't think of what it's called. It's so, Root of Evil, I think it's called. That's so fascinating. Is that what it is?
I think so, and it's about the murders basically. Yeah. But I haven't listened to it, but I've read about it.
It's grisly, but it's really fascinating. And there's one episode that kind of explores a little bit Man Ray's connection because he lived close by to the Black Dahlia murder site. I don't know. I didn't read about it, and so when I started going on tour for the book last February. Like the first couple places I went, people were like, what do you think about these Black Dahlia murders? And I was like, and I really had no idea. So the research that I had done on Man Ray was more specific to his early years. I read a ton about surrealism. I read, he has a book called Self-Portrait that delves into him and, you know, everything about him and his art and his life. And then, you know, I mean, I read all sorts of books like that, art history books and stuff, but I had not heard about the Black Dahlia murders, but now I know all about them. And
maybe there's a sequel.
Maybe. It'd be a very different book.
Very different book. Well, again, getting back to that though, and the relationship with Man Ray and Miller, did they ever meet again? Did they ever meet later in life?
Yeah, they did. And in fact, actually that their relationship unfolded a little bit differently than it does in my book. In the book, they lose touch after their relationship ends. And then, you know, later in life, they meet after a number of years have gone by. In reality, they did lose touch, but then they reconnected, I think actually even before World War II started. And they remained in touch via letter. And later when Lee had moved to Sussex, she would talk to Man Ray on the phone. So they became friends and they didn't see each other. I think maybe they saw each other once, but they basically didn't see each other until the very end of, it's towards the end of their lives when they did meet at an exhibit that was featuring Man Ray's work, which is similar to the scene that I have in my book.
Were there any stories about Man Ray and Lee Miller that you left out of the book for any reason? Any connections that they had that were interesting?
I left out so much stuff.
I can imagine.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think it's so interesting because I think when you write about a real person, especially somebody who is as vibrant and amazing as Lee Miller, it's more a paring away of her life than it is an expansion, because you kind of have to keep honing it down to figure out what you need to put into the book to really tell the story. But I'll tell you, so I had initially, at the very end of the novel, the epilogue that I have was about 5 pages longer, and it included this anecdote that I had found in my research that I loved so much. And I had it in there, and then I had to cut it because the ending is better without it there, but I will tell you it. So Man Ray and Lee Miller met at this exhibit of Man Ray's work, and they hadn't seen each other in a long time, and Man Ray was quite old at that point and a little bit infirm. And apparently in a storage room behind the exhibit, there was this big storage tube, like a big round tube that had housed a sculpture. And the storage tube was lying on its side. And Man Ray always had this like very playful energy to him. And, you know, he was like a fun guy. And he got up and crawled in one end of this tube. And he's in the tube, and apparently he's like, Lee Miller, like, you know, shouting at her through this tube. And she got into the other end of the tube and like crawled in, and then they met in the middle just for the hell of it. And I just, as an image, I just love that. Like, I just think there's something so lovely about this sort of coming together of these two people who had shared these experiences early in their lives and, you know, were now at the end of their lives, and just this moment of joy. And anyway, so I had that in the book initially.
There's almost a kind of a sadness to it as well, a kind of an ache to it that they did have this moment in time, and now they're they're in a different stage of their lives and kind of thinking back on it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it has all those, it has like the sort of the joy and the sadness mixed, and it's so nice. But it's so, it tells you exactly how to feel. Like if I had included that scene, if you got to the end of the book, you would be like, the author is explaining to me how I should read this book. And it was a little bit too much, you know?
Barbara from Brookline asks, did Man Ray really win that Philadelphia Prize, and did Lee really keep that from him? Is that
so
true?
That's dramatized. And that is, it's so the Philadelphia Prize in the book, that's not actually a real prize, that's fictional. But he, again and again, actually would sign his name to work that she had done herself and take it as his own. And Lee Miller found that very frustrating. I too find that very frustrating, even though, as I explain it in the book, you know, I think Lee Miller thought about the work that she was creating in his studio as kind of his work on some level, because it was his studio, she was his assistant. And so to him, I don't think it was terrible to be, you know, kind of appropriating work that she did when she was working with him. But of course, she would take umbrage over that. So I dramatized that prize as a way to kind of encapsulate that theft that he took of her work by signing his name to it.
And that's fairly clear. It's fairly well accepted that a lot of Man Ray's work could have been Lee Miller's work. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are things. I think there's even I can't remember what museum. There's a museum with a photograph hanging in it. It says like Man Ray / Lee Miller ? Like they don't know.
They don't even know. I assume that came out somewhere, was treated in the Peabody Essex exhibition, right?
I think so. Yes. Yeah, I'm sure it was.
Yeah. Elizabeth asks us about the process, again, writing the novel. How long did it take you to create this work? This is your first, right? This is your first novel.
Yeah.
But you've been creatively writing for a number of years, right?
Yeah. So I've been writing, I've sort of been writing for my whole life. And I went to college I chose the college that I went to because it had a good creative writing program. And then I got an MFA, and then I worked for a decade at Grub Street. And if you're local to Boston, you might know of Grub Street. It's a nonprofit creative writing center based downtown. So, it's sort of, my life has always been in the writing world, but it kind of wasn't until I was writing this book that I started to really think of myself as a writer. And I had this like wild epiphany during the process of writing this book, where I suddenly was like, oh, I'm writing a novel about a woman who wants to be an artist and can't call herself an artist. And I had struggled to call myself a writer. And it was this weird moment. And I was like, God, I just need to own this, it's very strange. But anyway, so I have always been writing, but this is the first book that I've written.
And is it as much of a painstaking process, like in terms of your getting back to the structure? How do you do this? You referenced that you wrote descriptions, for example, of some of the photographs, or imagined scenes around those photographs. Is that how your writing style comes into effect? I'm talking about now the physical methodology of it. Do you write it in snippets and then bring it all together? Is that what you prefer to do?
So what I did was, with the first draft, that's exactly what I did. I would take snippets of research, I would take photographs, any inspiration I could find, and I would write scenes. And I wrote them out of order, and I didn't totally know where they were going, but I was just exploring who the characters were. And I figured, like, I'll write these and then I'll figure out how it all fits together. And so I did a bunch of that. And then as I was revising it, I became like the exact opposite sort of writer. I created this giant spreadsheet that I called the grid. And it has like many, many, many columns in it. And in it, I organized everything about the book that I could think of, like the research, the timeline. And I wanted the spreadsheet to both track the plot of the book, but also the emotional arc of Lee's journey. So literally just her emotional state, scene by scene and chapter by chapter. And creating that spreadsheet, that sort of master plan for it, was really, really helpful in getting me from this mishmash of scenes to a completed manuscript. I don't think I could have done it without having done that work.
It really is just an amazing, in terms of historical fiction, is that an area that you would have set out if somebody said to you when you're writing workshops as a student, for example, your first novel is going to be a work of historical fiction. Is that something you would have said, yeah, it's always been in my mind, or did this happen by accident?
Oh, this is a good question. I mean, it's what I read, but I hadn't really thought about that. Like I grew up reading historical fiction. Like I was this nerdy kid and I was reading like Laura Ingalls Wilder and Anne of Green Gables and The Little Princess and Little Lord Fauntleroy and all those books that are just like deep into the nerddom of history. And I loved that. And even still, I mean, my reading taste has expanded a bit, but I love historical fiction, and a number of my favorite books are, would fall under that category. Would I have said that would be what I wrote? I don't know. Everything I wrote up to this point was contemporary short stories. None of them are very good, which maybe should have been a sign. But once I found this story and found how it feels to write from history, I really love that. And I feel like to me, it's really exciting because you have this framework of a person's life or historical events, and you can kind of push at that and fictionalize out from the truth rather than imagining everything whole cloth. And for some reason, I just find that really, really interesting and exciting as a writer.
Again, getting back to some of the readers' questions here, a couple of questions around the nature of the sexual abuse Lee suffered, because that's kind of a pivotal part of the development of her personality and, of course, her whole approach to life and PTSD. This is from Renee. The blindfold incident seems like the tip of the abuse iceberg, more about her relationship with her father, again, going back to that theme.
Yes, although I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what the...
I think Renee is just asking a question again about the specific nature. We talked about it a little earlier on as well. She was raped by a family, one of her family that she stayed with. Is that correct?
It was a friend of the family. It was a man that they called uncle because he was so close to the family. He wasn't actually related to her.
Gotcha. And the blindfold incident, it says here, I'm just reading it directly. The blindfold incident seems like the tip of the abuse iceberg. Could you tell us more about her relationship with her father? Again, we did cover a little bit about this. You said she was actually quite close to her father, and that the naked photographs shouldn't be taken as much as they would to a current reader as evidence of a direct abuse.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and make of this what you will, but I think her father, what he said he was doing was he said he was trying to help her heal from this rape by taking her photograph. I mean, that makes no sense to me at all. And I frankly don't know, I don't know if that was just his way of justifying his bad behavior or if he truly thought he was helping her. I don't know. But I do know that, she suffered the rape, and then her parents took her to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist told her therapy in those days is it's mind-bogglingly bad. A therapist was like, you should take these memories and you should put them in a little box and you should throw away the key and you should never think about this again. And so that was the advice for dealing with this trauma. And they also said to her that she was supposed to think about, she's 7 at this time, that she's supposed to think about sex and love as being completely separate things. And so, there's don't mix those things up in her mind. So if you can imagine hearing those things when you're that age, it's going to create this closed off aspect of you. And Lee Miller multiple times described herself as feeling like she had a devil inside of her, feeling like she was split into 2 halves, the dark and the light, feeling like she was a puzzle where all of the pieces could never be fit back together again. And, I think it's like those were her ways of trying to make sense of this thing that was nonsensical that had happened to her when she was so young.
You start the book basically describing Lee as a damaged person. I mean, she was drinking heavily at that point, almost to the point of oblivion, when her Vogue editor comes to see her at one of those elongated dinners. Was she an absolutely damaged person all through her life, or did it get worse as she aged?
So I think, my armchair psychology of Lee Miller, but just in thinking about her as much as I have, I think that she experienced this trauma when she was young, which of course affected her for the rest of her life. I think actually the relationship with Man Ray was a further trauma kind of layered on top of that. And then I think her experience during the war was yet another layer on top of that. So I think it was really the war that left her as damaged as she was at the end of her life. She absolutely had PTSD, even though they didn't have that term at the time to describe what she was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
She had that. She was clinically depressed. She was an alcoholic. She was really, really suffering after the war. And I think she just couldn't recover from what she had seen. And I think a piece of the reason why she couldn't was that because she had already been traumatized in such a way when she was young, she didn't have any ability to separate herself from what she was seeing in the war. She allowed herself to be extremely close to what she was seeing. And her work reflects that. If you look at her war work, it's so intimate. And she would shoot scenes really close up. And there's just this sense that she herself was just a part of the scene. And I think if you can't separate yourself from what you're seeing in a situation like that, it's almost impossible to get over it.
Moving on from this character, is there another character that's going to frame your next novel, Brittany?
Yeah. So
are you at liberty to say who that is, or is it a spoiler alert?
So I'm not. I feel like it's so annoying to be like, I'm not going to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you.
I didn't expect you to.
I'll say though, I've been like flailing around. If any of the people who are listening are writers, maybe you'll appreciate the fact that I have been trying to figure out what to write, and I've tried a couple different projects, and I keep not feeling like it's the right fit. And so for a while I was writing one thing, and then I had a new idea, and I was like, ooh, it's my like sexy book boyfriend, and I want to cheat on this one idea with this new idea. So I was kind of doing that for a while, but now I have landed on an idea and I feel really psyched about it. And so I feel like I don't want to talk about it because it's like too precious.
Historical fiction. Can I just do 20 guesses here? Historical fiction again. So we're looking forward to another story and a narrative around the character. Female? Female? Female?
It's another woman, but it's obviously it's a different type of story and different era and everything. So
tell us about your own life. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Denver, Colorado. What can I tell you? And I moved out east for college, went to Wesleyan University, and then I've lived up in Boston ever since graduating. So I've been here like exactly 20 years at this point. And
you've already described your voracious reading appetite as a young woman, and so literature always held a fascination for you. The classics, obviously, from what you described.
Yeah. I mean, I've always been a huge reader. My parents, I like changed to a new school when I was in 4th grade, and my parents like desperately wanted them to understand like the sort of student I was going to be, and they marched me in and they showed the teacher like stacks and stacks of books I had read over the summer break. I'm sure the teacher was like, great. But yeah, no, I love to read and read really widely now. Happy to give recommendations if you want me to do so.
Yeah, and we will certainly take those. Actually, we would love to publish those. We love recommendations, especially of authors that I know that we have on this series. So please, let's definitely follow up on that, because there were so many writers out there. I mean, writing and art generally is like the music business. There are so many great musicians out there, but it's very hard to get your name above the crowd. Yeah. Were you surprised? I mean, this is your first novel. It's been a pretty runaway success. Were you surprised at that, Whitney, when it started to happen?
Yeah, I was totally gobsmacked. I really was. I mean, I didn't even know if I could finish writing it. As I was working on it, I just kept being like, well, maybe I can finish a draft and maybe it'll be good enough that I can show my writing group. And, it was just these slow stages like that. And so then it ended up selling at auction, which is like, it's like every writer's dream. And it remains like the most incredible thing that's ever happened to me. It was really, really exciting.
What do you like personally to read? Physical books? Do you use a Kindle?
Oh,
audio?
100% physical books. I have a Kindle and I used it for a while, and then I realized that every single thing that I read on Kindle, I retain no memory of anything that I've read.
Really?
Yeah, literally, like it's like gone. It's just gone from my brain. So I have to read paper. and have that, like that memory sense where you can remember what side of the page something was on or whatever. I need that.
We've got time for a couple of other questions. So again, your Q&A is right down here at the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse on it, it should become visible. And I know we've still got some good questions coming in, but it's a fascinating story. I'm really intrigued as to what your new project is going to be. In terms of the series that is optioned, this is also, because this is your newest novel, this I assume will also be, or your first novel, this will also be a process that will be totally new to you. Do you know if you will have any input in the screenwriting, for example, or is that a completely different thing?
So the way that it's, the bit that has happened of it so far is that I did get a chance to meet the main writer who is writing a pilot. I guess what they're doing is they're going to write a pilot and put together some sort of presentation that they then shop around to different production companies, I guess. And so I've had a chance to talk to him, and he's lovely. And so if he were the writer who would go forward with the project, I would work with him actually and be able to have some input on it. I wouldn't have any interest in being like, writing it myself. I have no idea how to write a screenplay, but I would love to, I'd love to be able to like be an advisor.
One of the things you do, getting back to the novel itself and the Paris of that time, and Man Ray as a great purveyor of art and kind of knocking things down. He loved to be kind of out of the mainstream. What did you find about your research in that period of time? Was it really as exciting as it sounds like it is, or was there a pretentiousness to it? There are certain times that you talk about pretentiousness, or you seem to hint at it without getting directly to it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it was as exciting as everybody thinks it is. I think if you were in that circle, I feel like you would just have felt that energy in such a huge way. Everybody was feeding off of each other's projects, and literature and art and everything, film, were all in conversation with one another in this way that I do think was as exciting as we think it is. I also think, I was just thinking about the women, of that era who were trying to break in, in the case of Lee Miller, into this sort of world of surrealism, and how frustrating that must have been. So I wanted to add that element into the book too, because I think there were lots of surrealist women artists working in Paris at that time, and most of them did not get recognized at all, and certainly didn't get sort of invited into this like inner sanctum that was all male, unless they were the partner of one of the men in the inner sanctum. And how unbelievably frustrating that must have been to women who were working just as hard as men. So I wanted to put that element into the book. I wanted to put a couple other female artists into the book whose work I really loved, like Claude Cahun and Ilse Bing, who were fantastic photographers of the time. And then the pretentiousness, I don't know. I don't know if people at that time would have thought of what they were doing as pretentious, but I think on some level, there must have been somebody who was thinking that.
Yeah, at that particular time. I'm looking for a question here. I'm just going through some of it, but I can't actually find it right now. But it is just absolutely so wonderful to have you with us tonight here, and to have this as part of our very, very, very first book group. Have you done one of these before? Have you done one before online?
Yeah, I've done a handful of these online events, and honestly, I have to say, like, if there is one tiny upside to the shelter-in-place order, this is the only one that I can come up with. It's that I think it does give people an opportunity to connect in new ways that you wouldn't otherwise be able to attend an event necessarily. Like I imagine there are people who are not from the Boston area who wouldn't be able to come out in person, and you can just hop on your computer and be a part of something that otherwise you wouldn't be able to be a part of. So I think that's actually pretty cool. I got to do an event with the library in Paris, and something in Bath, England, and I just wouldn't have been able to be a part of those without Zoom.
Without zooming, yeah, it really
Without
is
Zoom.
just absolutely amazing. When you sit down to write, is it fun? This is from Hank Philippi Ryan, who's going to be up next, in actual fact, in our book club. Is it fun? Is it a chore? Do you journey into the world of your book? And does time disappear? I love that image. Does time disappear?
Oh, it's so nice. Hi, Hank. Oh, Hank is so great. You guys, everybody should read her book and come next month because she's fabulous. I don't know. I mean, you know, she'll have to answer this question next month and tell you too. I think sometimes writing is so fun. Sometimes you just get absolutely lost, and then you kind of come to the surface, and it's like, what time is it? Do I need to eat? Like, what's going on? But I think for me, like, that happens maybe 5 or 10% of the time. And the other, however, percentage is like more of a slog, and just more, it's a lot of the sort of imposter syndrome, and like, oh, I'm not good enough. I don't know what I'm doing. And, you know, all that feeling. And it's really, really hard to escape those feelings.
But it is a slog, as you point out. It's a lot of perspiration to get it right, isn't it? Elise says, did you have a vision and a plan for how the World War II interchapters connected to the main narrative in terms of imagery and theme? Was that something that you very specifically thought about, she asks?
So yes, I did actually. And and nobody has ever asked me that question, and that's so cool. So what I did was I wanted the World War II chapters to have their own arc within the larger narrative. So it both goes chronologically, so it tells Lee's experience during the war chronologically. But beyond that, I wanted the imagery that you find in those images to in some way tie to the chapter that came right before it. So whether that be like a sensory detail, like the smell of metal or something like that. So if there's one chapter that's war chapter that has like the smell of metal, and in the prior chapter, there's a similar image that happens. So it's like a very, 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 very subtle cue of like, oh, maybe this is the thing that would have triggered this World War II memory to come back. It's not the sort of thing that I would imagine that anybody would really pick up on except for me, but it's like in my spreadsheet, like, you know, like sensory image, smell of metal, and tying those things together.
So quickly, I think we're kind of approaching a final question here. Who was your favorite secondary character in the book? Kiki, Claude, Antonio, her best friend, Tanya, or Roland?
Oh gosh. Okay, well.
Yeah, an author has to play favorites here.
So
with your creations.
I mean, I think the most interesting secondary character is Claude Cahun, who, if she were alive today, would go by they, but at the time she went by she. She was this gender-bending, unbelievably fascinating photographer, and if you don't know her work, it's really worth checking it out. She's just, I mean, wild doesn't even begin to describe it. So for a real character, you know, that would be the one that I would say. But I also have a lot of love for Antonio, who I think he's a fictional character, and he's kind of a mishmash of the multiple men that Lee Miller cheated on Man Ray with. I just kind of compressed it down into one person. And I loved him because I think he was just like really well-meaning, and I think he did not get treated well by Lee, and it's sort of sad, but he's also, you know, he's like the boyfriend that we all wish we had.
Was Lee Miller really in a Cocteau film? What did she star in a movie?
Oh yes, yeah, she was.
That actually happened.
Yes, that happened, and that movie, you can find it on YouTube, and it's called The Blood of a Poet, and it's a film classic. It's taught in film schools all over the place, and it is a strange film, and it's worth checking out.
One question here, I'm not familiar with this, I must admit, but a question says, how do you compare your novel with a historical fiction novel? And I think this structure has been used before as well. Christina Baker Klein, A Piece of the World, choosing a famous painting and exploring the art and characters behind the painting. It's an intriguing way to go about it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I have not read that book, though I do love Christina Baker Klein's work. But there's also the girl with the pearl earring.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, you know, that's
Classic
similar thing. I barely remember that novel, though I loved it when I read it. You know, I mean, I think a lot of different pieces of historical fiction work in this same way. I think it's you take this nugget of a story, or you take a piece of history that has been forgotten or wasn't included in a rich way in regular history books, and you're able to explore that world and go in a bunch of different directions. And, you know, I, as a writer, love that. And I would imagine that, you know, how fun would it be to do that with a painting? I think that would be like absolutely just a joy.
It's a joy to meet you, Whitney, even if virtual. Look forward to your book readings. Look forward to your next novel, which I'm intrigued with already. We've got a little bit of a hint and an outline of it, but it was just a great pleasure to get to know you, to go behind your art and the story of this one Lee Miller. And look, as you said, all of the other characters are as intriguing as Lee herself, but she's certainly opened up a whole new world for me. There's a particular interest these days, isn't there, in World War II, pre-war and the war itself. Some great stories to come out of it.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, no, this was such a pleasure. Thank you, Brian. You were such a wonderful host.
Well, you're our first. We are the canaries in the coal mine. And I think we're still,
I feel like, did we have any glitches? I feel like it was fine.
I think we're still breathing. We are,
yeah.
And we've got a great team behind us there with Jen and Bailey and Abby, and of course WGBH is committed to this type of interchange. So we're so lucky to have public broadcasting these days. Again, thanks so much for tuning in to the first ever Beyond the Page. And again, special thanks to Whitney here on screen, Whitney Scher, for not only joining us, but for penning what proved to be a very interesting, and I certainly agree with this, beautifully, beautifully written novel, absolutely intriguing. And it's one of those novels that, if I can say, I read and I'm ready with Wikipedia, even for the slightest detail, to find out more, and it leads us down the rabbit hole, but it's a rabbit hole that's worth going down. All eager to know what we will be covering next month. I know you are from your comments there. You can join us in the coming weeks as we take a dive into the most recent novel by Hank Phillippi Ryan, who gave us a question tonight, by the way, the investigative reporter for WGH-TV in Boston and an award-winning novelist. Virtual conversation will take place on Wednesday, June 17th. That's coming up. I'll tune into that. Whitney, are you going to commit to joining me for that? We'll be
Absolutely.
On the other side of it.
I will put it on my calendar. I wouldn't miss
Popping questions.
Yeah.
Virtual conversation, as I said, that's Wednesday, June 17th. Look forward to connecting with you again. And we hope that you and your family are staying safe and healthy during this time. Thank you for your support of public broadcasting. Thank you for your support of such creative art that we have right in our midst here in the Boston area. I bet you're happy that you moved to Boston all those years ago. My son did the other thing, moved to Denver, Colorado. He says he's never coming back.
Oh, Denver is fabulous. But if you want to be a writer, this is a really fantastic place to be doing it.
Well, it sounds like you both and you each made the right decision.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us, Whitney, and have a great night.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. This is such a pleasure.
Bye.
Take care.